Should the American voter believe that he really truly has changed his stance on the issue? How much evolution should be allowed?
Well, I think on this issue, it's likely very little evolution has actually occurred on the Republican side of the aisle, because it was Donald Trump who put the conservative majority onto the Supreme Court that did overturn Roe versus Wade. And even though former President Trump has said that he believes that what the court did, which was to put it at the discretion of the states, that is the policy that he believes in and that is what he wants. Those in the pro-life movement who are supporting President Trump are not at all in agreement that that is where this should end. And they are pushing for a federal abortion ban. And I do think that given that his support really comes from evangelicals who would like to see a national abortion ban, he would be pressured into signing a law were it to arrive at his desk, not vetoing it as his vice presidential nominee suggested.
Well, Lara, does the same go for some of the ways in which we've seen Kamala Harris change her own tune, be it from her stance on health care to fracking that we saw her adopt in the 2019 primary versus what she's saying now, walking back, for example, her insistence that she would push for a fracking ban? Should the same standards not apply here?
Well, I think where things are a little different is that she is currently in office. She is part of an administration that has made decisions. And right now, oil production at this country is in an all-time high. So it is clear that she has moved away and has supported President Biden in his policies. Whether she moves back again or not would be a question for a future administration. But she has not in any way suggested that she is sort of returning to her prior stances.
Well, if we consider her as part of this administration, that also may mean that she's saddled with the baggage and the vulnerability surrounding the U.S. economy. This was a weak point for President Biden when he was still campaigning for re-election. And I wonder how you view that issue now, to what extent she may be able to successfully distance herself from that issue. And of course, a lot of that may depend on where we actually are in terms of employment and inflation come November, right?
Well, that's absolutely right. And the most interesting thing about Vice President Harris is that she is sort of running as a challenger, even though she is also part of the incumbent party. So we do see her trying to walk a fine line between taking credit for what this administration has done, but at the same time putting forward new economic proposals. Where we are headed, at least in terms of where the Federal Reserve is that they are saying inflation is coming down and they are preparing for cuts in September. Those cuts could certainly help the current administration, because as Americans look at their credit cards, which is really where they see the changes the fastest, the interest on their credit card debt will not be as high as it might have been had the Fed decided to hold even for longer. So there is a potential of some boost for the administration. And certainly unemployment has not risen enough, I think, for there to be a concern. And the number of jobs that are still being created, despite the revision, has been a very robust number during this entire administration to claim credit for.
Yeah, Lara, I noticed earlier today that Senator Elizabeth Warren, who we heard from earlier, had posted on X that she hopes that the Fed should cut at least 75 basis points next month, though I'm not aware of any economist that actually thinks they'd pursue an easing of policy that aggressively, that quickly. Of course, as we consider these issues, be them the economy or abortion, it's about how they resonate nationally, sure, but it's also about the very specific states, the swing states that could decide this election. And on the earlier edition of Balance of Power today, I spoke with University of Arizona School of Government professor Samara Klar about the importance of the ground game in states like Arizona. This is what she told me.
over a third of Arizonans identify as independent and tell pollsters that they are uncommitted to either party. Now, typically independents do favor one party over the other, but getting these groups mobilized and getting them, registered and ready to vote is it's essential. And the fact that there's such a big ground campaign going on right now in Arizona is going to be really, really essential. I mean, I am expecting a lot of knocks on my door and a lot of text messages and a lot of phone calls, and I think everybody in Arizona is going to experience that.
So, Lara, as we consider the ground game and what we've heard from the Harris campaign in recent days, which is that they've raised $540 million in just a 5-week span, really incredible figures, but also that they've signed up 200,000 volunteers. Which of those figures is more significant?
I think they're both significant because what we're talking about is money to empower the volunteers. They have, hundreds of campaign offices around the country in the swing states. They are going to be playing in every battleground at full strength. And that is something that is still uncertain when it comes to the Republican Party. We know that former President Trump has super PACs that are going to be supporting his efforts, but how sort of well-funded the RNC is to do the kinds of, on the ground, grassroots, door knocking, phone calling that really does push a campaign over the finish line remains in question. And I would also say that with regard to the grassroots effort and appealing to independents or to crossover Republicans, on several of the state ballots, there are going to be initiatives putting abortion rights into those states' constitutions as referenda. And that is something that could impact both the number and the sort of intensity of the turnout of both independents and unlikely voters.